My name is Althea Morrow. I am 74 years old. And the night they walked away from me, I was still standing there, holding what was left of my heart. Before I tell you how it happened, listen closely. Because the moment they turned their backs on me, the moment the door closed, the moment I realized I had stayed for people who never planned to stay for me. But first, if you love emotional, powerful stories like this, please subscribe to this channel. Like this video, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. And tell me in the comments, what part of the country are you watching from? I want to know who is sitting with me tonight. Now listen. I stayed for them, and they still walked away. The rain was heavy that evening. Not loud rain. The quiet kind that soaks into your bones. I stood by the door with my coat still on. My hands were shaking. Not from the cold. From waiting. The living room was almost empty. No pictures on the wall anymore. No shoes by the door. No voices. Just me. Then I heard the sound. A suitcase wheel rolling across the floor. I turned slowly. My daughter didn't look at me. Neither did my son. They were both packing up the last of their things. I swallowed hard and said, Are you coming back tonight? My daughter sighed. Not sad. Not angry. Just tired. No, Mama. That was all she said. I stepped forward. I stayed for you, I whispered. I stayed when I was tired. I stayed when I was sick. I stayed when your father left. I stayed when nobody else did. She zipped the bag shut. And then she said the words that still ring in my ears. We didn't ask you to. My knees almost gave out. They walked past me. Past the woman who raised them. Past the woman who gave up everything. The door opened. The door closed. And I was alone. But what you don't know yet, what they didn't know either, is what I was holding in my pocket when they walked out. Because that night, I was already standing on a secret. And by morning, everything would begin to fall apart. Let me take you back. I was not always old and tired. Once, I was strong in a different way. I raised my children in a small house with thin walls and loud dreams. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3. I cleaned offices at night. I cooked in a diner during the day. I came home smelling like grease and bleach, but my kids never went hungry. Their father left early, said he needed freedom. I never saw him again. So I became mother and father, provider and protector. When my knees started hurting, I didn't stop. When my back ached, I kept going. When my doctor said, "You need rest," I laughed. Because who would take care of them if I did? I stayed. When my daughter got pregnant young, I stayed. I raised her baby while she went back to school. When my son lost job after job, I stayed. I paid his rent when he couldn't. I told myself, one day they'll understand. But gratitude is quiet when people feel entitled. Slowly, something changed. They stopped asking how I felt. They stopped sitting with me. They stopped listening. I became invisible. The first time I realized I didn't matter anymore was on my birthday. 71 years old. No cake. No card. No hug. My daughter came home late and said, "Oh, was today your birthday?" I smiled and said yes. She nodded and went to her room. That night, I cried quietly so nobody would hear me. I still stayed. When my health started failing, I stayed. Even when my hands shook too much to hold a cup. Even when my legs burned walking up the stairs. They noticed. But they didn't help. "Rest later," my son would say. "You're strong, Mama." Strong. That word can be a curse. One afternoon, I came home early. I didn't mean to listen. I wasn't trying to spy. But voices carry when doors are open. My daughter said, "She's old. She won't be around much longer." My son laughed. "Once she's gone, the house is ours." I stood frozen. My heart dropped so hard I thought I would faint. They were talking about me, like I was already dead. That night, I didn't sleep. And that was the night I started preparing. Quietly, carefully, because staying had taught me something important. If you give people everything, they will feel entitled to your bones. I didn't tell anyone. Not my church friends. Not my neighbors. I started moving things. Reading papers. Making calls. Every morning, I still cooked breakfast. I still smiled. I still stayed. They never noticed the changes. They never asked. People rarely do. Until it's too late. Now we are back where we started. The rain. The suitcase. The goodbye with no goodbye. When the door closed, I leaned against it and slid down to the floor. My chest hurt. My hands trembled. I reached into my coat pocket. And I felt it. The envelope. The one I had prepared weeks ago. The one they never knew about. Inside it was the truth. Inside it was the reason they would regret walking away. I whispered into the empty room. "I stayed for you, but I didn't disappear." Then I stood up. Because this is only the beginning. And what I did next, they never saw coming. Before I continue this story, kindly subscribe, like, turn on the bell, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The morning after they left, the house did not feel quiet. It felt hollow. There is a difference. Quiet can be peaceful. Hollow feels like something has been taken from inside you and never returned. I woke up on the couch because I could not bring myself to sleep in my bedroom. Their footsteps were still there in my mind. Their voices still hanging in the air like dust that refused to settle. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of my own breathing, wondering when my chest had started to feel so tight. For a long time, I did not move. I stayed like that because staying had always been what I did best. When I finally stood up, my knees complained, but I ignored them. I shuffled into the kitchen and put water on the stove. I reached for 3 cups out of habit, then froze. I stared at them like they had betrayed me too. Slowly, I put 2 of them back in the cupboard and kept only 1. That was the first thing that made my eyes burn. I sat at the table alone, the same table where I had served food for years. I could still see my daughter sitting there, tapping her phone, barely looking up when I spoke. I could still see my son leaning back in his chair, asking for seconds like the food appeared by magic. I had stayed for them. I stayed when my body begged me to stop. And still, they walked away. People think staying means weakness. They think leaving is strength, but staying takes something out of you. It eats you slowly, day by day, until you forget who you were before you became the one who never leaves. I stayed after their father walked out on us with a single suitcase and a promise he never kept. I stayed when I was 35 years old with 2 children and no one to lean on. I stayed when I learned how to stretch a bag of rice into 3 meals and a prayer. I stayed when the lights were cut off and I cooked by candlelight, telling my children stories so they would not be afraid. I told myself I was doing the right thing. When they got older, I stayed again. When my daughter said she wanted to move back home, just for a while, I stayed. When a while turned into years, I stayed. When my son lost his job and needed help, I stayed. When their needs became expectations, I stayed. I stayed when I should have rested. I stayed when my hands began to shake in the mornings. When my doctor said my blood pressure was too high and asked me if I was under stress, I laughed and said, "Who is?" I stayed because I believed that love meant endurance. But love without respect becomes something else. It becomes entitlement. I began to notice the way they spoke to me. Not angry, not cruel, just dismissive. Like I was furniture that had always been there and always would be. They talked over me. They made decisions without me. They rearranged my house and told me it was better this way. One afternoon, I came home from church and found my old armchair gone. The one my husband and I had bought together before everything fell apart. My daughter told me it was too bulky and didn't match the room anymore. "You didn't ask me," I said softly. She shrugged. "You don't really use it." I stood there thinking about how many nights I had cried in that chair, how many prayers I had whispered into its arms, how much of my life had been held by something they threw away without a thought. I stayed quiet. That became my habit too. Silence. Silence when my son used my car without asking and returned it empty. Silence when my daughter told me I was old-fashioned and didn't understand how the world worked anymore. Silence when they joked about me right in front of me, lowering their voices just enough to pretend they were not being cruel. I told myself they were stressed. I told myself they were still young. I told myself they would come around. I stayed. The night I overheard them talking about the house, something inside me cracked, but it did not break all the way. Not yet. I stood in the hallway listening to them speak about my life like it was already over. I heard my son say, "Once she's gone, everything will be easier." I heard my daughter say, "She won't even know what's happening." I walked back to my room like a ghost. That night, I cried into my pillow, not because they had hurt me, but because I finally understood something painful. They did not see me as a person anymore. I was a phase they were waiting to end. From that moment, I stayed differently. I started watching instead of giving, listening instead of explaining. I noticed papers moved from places I remembered. I noticed mail opened that wasn't theirs. I noticed conversations stopping when I entered the room. I stayed quiet, because quiet people are underestimated. When they walked out that rainy night, I thought the pain would destroy me. But standing alone in that empty house, I felt something else too. Relief. It scared me. Because relief meant I had been carrying something too heavy for too long. The phone rang 2 days later. My daughter's name flashed on the screen, and my heart still jumped like it always did. Love does not turn off just because someone hurts you. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask if I was okay. She said, "We need to talk about the house." I sat down slowly. "What about it?" I asked. There was a pause, then her voice hardened. "We just need to make sure everything is settled." Settled? Like I was already finished. I told her I would talk when I was ready. I could hear the annoyance in her breath before she hung up. After that call, I did something I had never done before. I went into my bedroom and locked the door. I pulled out the old box from under my bed, the one filled with documents I had not touched in years, papers I had signed when I trusted the people around me, letters I had folded and unfolded so many times the creases felt like scars. As I read, my hands trembled. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Dates did not match. Signatures looked strange. Pages were missing where I knew there had once been more. My name appeared in places it should not have been and disappeared where it should have been clear. A cold fear settled in my stomach. I remembered my daughter asking about the house weeks before they left, the way she watched my face, the way my son suddenly became interested in helping with paperwork. They were not just planning to leave. They were planning to take something with them. Something they believed I would never notice. I folded the papers carefully and placed them back in the envelope, the same envelope I had touched that night by the door, the one that now felt heavier than before. I sat on the edge of my bed and whispered, "Lord, give me strength." Because staying had taught me how to endure pain. But now, I was about to learn how to face truth. And the truth was this: the people I stayed for were no longer my family in the way I had believed. They were something else now, something dangerous. That evening, I heard a knock at the door. Soft, careful. Not the knock of someone who belongs. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding. Through the peephole, I saw a familiar face. Someone from my past. Someone who knew things about me that my children never bothered to learn. I opened the door halfway. They looked at me and said, "Althea, I think you need to sit down. There's something you should know." And as they spoke the next sentence, my blood ran cold, because it confirmed my worst fear. They hadn't just walked away from me. They had already started trying to erase me. And now that I knew, nothing would ever be the same again, I did not invite her inside right away. I stood there holding the door halfway open, my fingers tight around the edge, my heart beating so loudly I was afraid she could hear it. The woman standing outside was someone I had not seen in years, someone I never expected to see at my door again, especially not after the night my children walked away. Her name was Maribel Owens. She was not family, but she knew my family better than most. Years ago, when my husband was still alive, she had worked with him at the warehouse. Later, when he left, she stayed in touch with me, not closely, but enough to remember things, enough to notice when something felt wrong. She looked older now. We both did. Her hair was pulled back, streaked with gray, her eyes serious in a way that made my stomach twist. "Althea," she said again, softer this time, "I don't want to scare you, but I can't leave without saying this." I stepped back and let her in. She sat at my kitchen table, the same one where my children had eaten for years. She placed her purse on the floor carefully, like she was afraid to make too much noise. I poured her a glass of water, though my hands shook so badly some of it spilled. She watched me quietly. "You don't look surprised to see me," she said. I gave a small laugh that held no joy. "I don't think I can be surprised anymore." She nodded slowly, then leaned forward. "I saw your daughter 2 days ago." My chest tightened. "Where?" "At the records office," she said. The room felt smaller. Maribel worked part-time there now. Filing, sorting, quiet work for quiet people. She had always been the observant type, the kind who noticed details others missed. "She asked for copies of property documents," Maribel continued. "Your property." I swallowed. That doesn't make sense." Maribel's eyes did not leave mine. "She already had some papers with her, Althea. Papers with your name on them." The envelope in my bedroom felt like it was burning a hole through the floor. "What kind of papers?" I asked. Maribel hesitated. The kind people bring when they think something already belongs to them. Silence fell between us, thick and heavy. I thought about all the times my daughter had said, "Don't worry, Mama, I'll handle it." All the times my son had taken documents from my hands and said, "You won't understand this stuff." All the times I had trusted them because I believed love meant safety. "I didn't tell her anything," Maribel said quickly. "I told her she needed you there. She didn't like that." Of course she didn't. After Maribel left, I sat alone at the table for a long time. I stared at the place where my children used to sit, where I used to watch them eat, laugh, argue. I tried to remember the last time any of them had asked me how I was feeling. I couldn't. That night, I slept in my bed for the first time since they left. Sleep did not come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their backs as they walked out, heard the zipper of the suitcase, felt the air change when the door closed. Sometime near dawn, I made a decision. I would not confront them. Not yet. I had stayed my whole life. I had learned patience the hard way. And patience, when mixed with truth, becomes power. The next morning, I woke up early and dressed slowly. I chose a simple dress, one I had worn to church many times. Comfortable shoes. No jewelry except my wedding band, which I still wore out of habit, even after all these years. I looked at myself in the mirror. My face looked tired. My eyes carried years of sacrifice, but beneath the tiredness, something else was there now. Clarity. I left the house and walked down the street to Mrs. Coleman's place. She was already on her porch, rocking gently, watching the world like she always did. She looked at me and said, "You didn't sleep." I shook my head. She patted the chair beside her. "Sit." I told her everything, about Maribel, about the papers, about the call, about the way my children had been acting long before they left. She listened without interrupting, her lips pressed together, her eyes dark with understanding. When I finished, she said something that stayed with me. "People think staying means you owe them forever. But staying only means you gave them time. It doesn't give them the right to erase you. Later that day, my son called. His voice sounded casual, like we were just checking in on each other. "Mama," he said, "we need to come by and grab a few more things." "When?" I asked. "Tonight," he said. "We'll be quick." I agreed. And then I did something I had never done before. I prepared. I laid out the papers I had found. I placed them back inside the envelope. I made copies of everything just in case. I wrote down dates, times, names. My handwriting was slow but steady. When evening came, I heard the familiar sound of their car pulling up. They walked in like nothing had changed. My daughter avoided my eyes. My son smiled too much. They moved through the house, pointing, whispering, deciding. At one point, my son said, "We should take the TV too. It's basically ours." I looked at him. "Why do you think that?" He laughed, "Because you won't need it." Something in his tone made my stomach turn. They gathered what they wanted, then stood by the door again, ready to leave. My daughter finally looked at me. "We'll talk soon," she said. I nodded. "Yes," I said softly, "we will." After they left, I locked the door and leaned against it, my heart racing. Because now I knew something they didn't. They thought I was alone, confused and slow. They thought staying had made me weak. They were wrong. That night, I received a message on my phone. It was from Maribel. "You need to come to the records office tomorrow," it read. "There's something else, and it's worse than I thought." I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. Whatever they were trying to do, it was already in motion. And tomorrow, I would finally see how far they were willing to go. I whispered into the quiet house, "I stayed for you." My voice didn't shake this time. And now I'm staying for myself. I did not sleep that night. I lay on my back staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house breathe. Every creak sounded louder than it ever had before. Every shadow felt heavier. My phone rested on my chest, Maribel's message still glowing in my mind, even though the screen had gone dark hours ago. "There's something else, and it's worse than I thought." Those words kept repeating themselves. I turned on my side and pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, but it did nothing to calm me. My thoughts kept drifting back through the years, searching for signs I might have missed. Moments that felt small at the time, but now looked different when held up to the light of truth. I remembered the day my daughter insisted on driving me to the office to handle some paperwork. She had said it was too complicated for me, that I would get tired waiting. I remembered signing where she pointed, trusting her because she was my child. I remembered my son standing nearby, arms crossed, watching carefully. At the time, I thought they were being helpful. Now, lying there in the dark, I wondered what I had really signed. When morning finally came, I got dressed slowly, my body stiff, my heart heavy. I ate a small breakfast, though food had no taste. Before leaving, I stood in the hallway and looked at the walls where family photos used to hang. Most of them were gone now, taken down by my children when they moved out, but I could still see the lighter patches where frames once rested. I touched one of those spots gently. "I stayed," I whispered, not sure who I was speaking to. "I stayed." The walk to the bus stop felt longer than usual. My legs ached, but I welcomed the pain. It reminded me that I was still here, still breathing, still able to move forward even if each step felt uncertain. At the records office, Maribel was waiting for me near the entrance. She looked tense, her fingers twisting together as soon as she saw me. "I'm glad you came," she said quietly. She led me inside, past rows of filing cabinets and low desks where people worked in silence. The air smelled like paper and dust. We stopped in a small room with a table and 2 chairs. She closed the door behind us. "I need to show you something," she said. She pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. My name was on the front. My heart dropped. I opened it slowly, afraid of what I might see, but needing to see it all the same. Inside were copies of documents I barely recognized, mixed with others that looked familiar. As I flipped through them, my hands began to shake. There were forms that suggested ownership changes, notes in margins that were not written by me, dates that did not match my memory at all. Marable pointed to one page. This one was filed last month. I stared at it. I wasn't here last month. I know, she said. Another page. This one has your signature, she continued, but it doesn't match the way you usually sign your name. I felt dizzy. So what does this mean? I asked. Marable hesitated before answering. It looks like someone is trying to make it seem like you already agreed to transfer things. Transfer things. My life. My home. My safety. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. For a moment, I felt very small, very old. The room seemed to spin, and I had to take deep breaths to steady myself. They think I won't notice, I said quietly. Marable nodded, or that you won't be able to stop it. I opened my eyes and looked at her. What happens next? She sighed. That depends on what you do. I thanked her and left the office with the folder clutched tightly under my arm. The sky outside looked the same as it always did, people walking past like nothing in the world had changed. But for me, everything felt different. On the ride home, memories kept surfacing. The times my children rushed me through conversations. The way they grew impatient when I asked questions. The way they talked about the future as if I was not part of it. I had stayed silent because I thought silence was kindness. I was wrong. When I got home, the house felt colder than before. I locked the door behind me and went straight to my bedroom. I laid the folder on my bed and sat beside it, staring at it like it might bite me if I touched it again. I thought about calling my daughter. I imagined asking her directly, hearing her explain, maybe even apologize. But deep down, I knew better. People who plan in secret rarely tell the truth when confronted. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the street. I saw children riding bikes, neighbors talking, life moving forward like it always does. I wondered how many other women had stayed the way I had, trusting the wrong people, giving until there was almost nothing left. That afternoon, my phone rang again. This time, it was my son. "Mama," he said, his voice smooth, "we forgot to grab a few documents. We'll come by tomorrow." I closed my eyes for a second before answering. "What documents?" "Just some old stuff," he said quickly. "Nothing you need to worry about." Nothing you need to worry about. I felt something harden inside my chest. "All right," I said calmly. "Come tomorrow." After the call ended, I sat very still. They were coming back. And they did not know what I knew. That night, I went through the folder again, slowly, carefully. I made notes in a small notebook, writing down everything that felt off. Dates, names, places. I took breaks when my eyes burned, but I did not stop. Staying had taught me endurance. Now endurance was turning into resolve. The next morning, I woke early and cleaned the house. Not because it needed it, but because I needed something to do with my hands. I wiped down surfaces, folded blankets, straightened chairs. I moved through each room with intention, reminding myself that this was still my home. When their car pulled up later that day, my heart beat fast, but my face stayed calm. They walked in like before, acting casual, talking about nothing important. My daughter smiled too brightly. My son avoided looking at the table where the folder now rested, hidden beneath a stack of magazines. They sat down and my son leaned forward. "So, about the paperwork." I looked at them both. "I went to the records office," I said. The room went quiet. My daughter's smile faded. "Why would you do that?" "Because I wanted to understand," I replied. "Something I should have done a long time ago." My son cleared his throat. "You're worrying for nothing, Mama. We're just trying to help." I reached for the folder and slid it across the table. "Then explain this," I said. They froze. My daughter picked up one of the pages, her hands trembling just slightly. She glanced at my son, then back at me. "You don't understand how these things work," she said, her voice sharper now. "I understand enough," I replied. The air between us felt thick, heavy, like something was about to break. My son stood up suddenly. You're overreacting, he said. You always do this, you stay stuck in the past. I looked up at him, really looked at him, and saw not my little boy, but a grown man who had learned to take without asking. I stayed in the past for you, I said quietly, so you could move forward. He turned away, packing the room. My daughter sighed loudly. This is exactly why we needed space. Space. That word again. I folded my hands in my lap and felt my heart pounding, but my voice stayed steady. If you have something to say it. They exchanged a look. And then my daughter spoke. There's something you need to understand, Mama, she said. Whether you like it or not, things are already in motion. Those words hit me harder than any slap. I felt a chill run through my body. Because now I knew the truth. They were not asking. They were telling. And whatever they had started, they believed it was already too late for me to stop it. I looked at my children, the ones I had stayed for all my life, and realized that the next choice I made would decide everything. The room fell silent. And in that silence, I felt something rise inside me. Not fear. Not sadness. Something stronger. And what I said next would change the course of this story forever. Before I continue this story, kindly subscribe, like, turn on the bell, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I did not raise my voice. That surprised them. They were waiting for me to cry, to beg, to panic. They were used to that version of me, the woman who softened first, who explained herself, who tried to keep peace even when peace was already gone. But this time, I stayed quiet. The silence made them uncomfortable. My daughter shifted in her seat. My son stopped packing and looked at me like he was trying to read my face, trying to figure out what I was thinking. I could see it in his eyes. He was nervous. Good. I want you both to sit down, I said calmly. They hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. Eventually, they sat. I folded my hands in my lap and took a slow breath. My heart was beating fast, but I did not let it show. I had spent my whole life controlling pain so others would not feel it. Now I was using that same strength for myself. You said things are already in motion, I said. I want to hear what that means. My daughter looked at the table. My son spoke first. Mama, we were just planning ahead. Planning ahead for what? I asked. For the future, he said. For when things get harder for you. I nodded slowly. And did you plan to tell me? My daughter sighed. You wouldn't have understood. That sentence hurt more than anything else she could have said. Not because it was true, but because she believed it. I understand more than you think, I said. She looked up then, irritation flashing across her face. Mama, please, you're tired. You don't need stress like this. I almost laughed. They were stealing from me and calling it care. You opened papers with my name on them, I said. You went to offices without me. You talked about my house like I was already gone. My son shook his head. You're twisting things. I leaned forward slightly, then untwist them. Another silence. This one was heavier. Finally, my daughter spoke, her voice tight. We were just trying to make sure nothing gets complicated later. Later, I repeated. When? She didn't answer. Because later meant after I was no longer useful. I felt something break inside me, not loudly, not dramatically, but cleanly, like a rope snapping after being pulled too tight for too long. I stayed for you, I said quietly. I stayed when your father left. I stayed when you were hungry. I stayed when you needed someone to raise your children. I stayed when my body was failing me. My son crossed his arms, and we appreciate that. No, I said, you benefited from it. He opened his mouth, then closed it. I did not stay so you could erase me, I continued. I did not stay so you could decide my life without me. My daughter's eyes filled with tears, but they did not soften her voice. So what do you want, Mama? That question told me something important. She was no longer asking what I needed. She was asking what would make me stop. I stood up slowly. My legs shook, but I stayed upright. I want time, I said. Time to understand everything. Time to make my own decisions. My son scoffed. You're dragging this out. I looked at him. I dragged my whole life for you. That shut him up. They left shortly after, frustrated, whispering to each other by the door like children caught doing something wrong. When the door closed behind them, I did not collapse this time. I went straight to my bedroom and locked the door. That night I cried. Not loud sobs. Quiet tears that soaked into my pillow as I whispered every question I had never asked out loud. Why wasn't I enough? Why did staying turn into something they used against me? Why did love become a weakness in their hands? By morning, my tears were gone. In their place was something steadier. I began making calls. Not to lawyers. Not to courts. I called people who knew me before I became invisible. Old church friends. Former coworkers. Women who had watched me give and give until there was almost nothing left. I didn't tell them everything. I just asked questions. And every answer confirmed the same thing. What my children were doing was not care. It was control. Days passed. They stopped calling. That silence felt planned. Like they were waiting for me to give up. Instead, I started writing. Not letters. Records. I wrote down every conversation I remembered, every date, every promise, every moment something felt wrong. My hands cramped, but I kept going. Staying had trained me for this kind of work. Late one evening, my phone buzzed. A message from my daughter. We need to move forward. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I stared at the words for a long time. Then I typed back. I am moving forward, just not with you leading me. There was no reply. The next morning, Maribel called. Her voice was tense. They came back, she said. Your son, he tried to ask about accelerating the process. My stomach dropped. What process? Maribel hesitated. The one that assumes you won't object. I closed my eyes. They were not waiting anymore. They were pushing. That night, as I sat alone in my living room, the same room where I had raised them, fed them, prayed over them, I finally understood the truth I had been avoiding. They didn't walk away from me because I failed them. They walked away because I was finally in the way. And the next move they made would force me to choose between staying silent or finally standing up in a way they could not ignore. I looked around my home, touching the walls, the furniture, the memories. I stayed for you, I whispered. But you don't get to take everything I am. Outside, a car slowed in front of my house. I heard footsteps on the walkway. And then a knock. Not soft. Not careful. Demanding. My heart pounded as I stood up and walked toward the door. Because whoever was standing on the other side, they were not here to ask anymore. Before I continue this story, kindly subscribe, like, turn on the bell, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I stood still for a moment before opening the door. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed to steady myself. The knock came again, harder this time. I opened the door slowly. My son stood there. My daughter was beside him. And behind them, leaning against the railing like he owned the place, was a man I did not recognize. He was tall, well-dressed, not in a suit, but in neat clothes that looked expensive without trying too hard. He held a slim folder under his arm and smiled at me like we were old friends. Mama, my son said quickly, this won't take long. I looked past him, straight at the stranger. And who is this? I asked. The man stepped forward before either of my children could answer. My name is Victor, he said smoothly. I'm here to help your family move forward. Family. That word again. I opened the door wider and stepped aside. Come in. They looked surprised. They thought I would refuse. They thought I would argue on the porch like a confused old woman. I did not. Inside, they spread out like they belonged there. My daughter sat on the couch. My son stood near the window. Victor took a seat across from me at the table, placing his folder down carefully, like he was setting something valuable in front of a buyer. "Mrs. Morrow," he said, "we're just here to clear up a few misunderstandings." "There are no misunderstandings," I replied. "Only things done without my consent." He smiled politely. "That's what we're hopping to resolve." My daughter jumped in. "Mama, Victor is just helping us organize things. You know, paperwork can be confusing." I looked at her, not as confusing as betrayal. Her face hardened. Victor opened his folder and slid a document toward me. "This is a standard arrangement," he said. "It protects everyone." I did not touch it. "Protects who?" I asked. My son sighed loudly. "Mama, stop making this difficult." Difficult. That word sat heavy in my chest. "I stayed for you," I said, looking at him. "And you learned how to call my resistance difficult." Victor cleared his throat. "Mrs. Morrow, the truth is, things are already changing. The sooner we work together, the easier it will be." There it was again. Already changing. "You keep saying that," I said. "Explain what you mean." He hesitated just long enough to tell me he did not expect that question. "There are steps being taken," he said carefully. "Plans, transfers." I leaned back in my chair. "Without me." My daughter looked away. Victor smiled again, but this time it did not reach his eyes. "With respect, Mrs. Morrow, sometimes decisions have to be made for the greater good." I laughed softly. The sound surprised all of us. "The greater good." I repeated, "You mean what benefits them?" My son snapped. "Why are you acting like we're enemies?" I looked at him slowly. "Because enemies don't always wear strangers' faces." Silence fell. Victor closed his folder. "Perhaps we should step away for now." "No," I said firmly. "You came here, you will listen." My voice did not shake. That surprised even me. "I stayed for decades," I continued. "I stayed when it hurt. I stayed when I was invisible. I stayed so you could stand where you are now." I stood up. "And you learned from my staying that you could move around me." My daughter stood too. "Mama, you're tired. Let's not do this." "I am tired," I said, "but not confused." Victor stood, adjusting his jacket. "Mrs. Morrow, if you choose not to cooperate, things could become uncomfortable." Uncomfortable. The word landed like a threat. My heart pounded, but I did not back away. "Get out," I said quietly. My son's eyes widened. "Mama." "Get out," I repeated. Victor stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well." They left without another word. When the door closed, my knees almost buckled. But I did not fall. I locked the door, I leaned against it, and I breathed. That night, fear tried to crawl into my chest, whispering that I was alone, that I had pushed too far, that staying silent would have been safer. But another voice rose louder. The voice of every woman who ever stayed too long. The next morning, I found an envelope taped to my door. No name. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A deadline. A date circled in red. And a sentence written at the bottom. "If you don't cooperate, this will move forward without you." My hands trembled as I held it. Because now I understood something clearly. They were not just planning around me. They were counting on my fear. And what they did not know yet, what none of them knew, was that staying had already taught me how to survive fear. The question now was not whether they would push harder. The question was what would happen when they realized I would not step aside. I folded the paper carefully and placed it on the table. And for the first time since they walked away, I smiled, because I knew exactly what I was going to do next. Before I continue this story, kindly subscribe, like, turn on the bell, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I did not act right away. That surprised even me. The envelope sat on my table for 3 days, untouched like a quiet challenge. I walked past it every morning. I dusted around it. I made my tea and drank it slowly, forcing myself not to rush. For most of my life, I had reacted quickly, fixing things, smoothing things over, making sure everyone else was comfortable. This time, I stayed still on purpose. Fear wants you to hurry. Power grows when you slow down. At night, I slept lightly. Every sound outside made my heart jump. I imagined footsteps, imagined keys at the door, imagined voices whispering plans without me. But each morning, the sun came up like it always did, and I was still there. Still breathing. Still standing. Still in my home. On the 4th day, I took the envelope and placed it inside my handbag. I dressed carefully, not fancy, not weak-looking either, just myself. A simple blouse, a long skirt, comfortable shoes. I looked in the mirror and studied my face. I saw fear there, but I also saw something new. Resolve. I left the house and locked the door behind me, feeling the weight of that lock like a promise. I walked slowly to the bus stop, my mind replaying every moment from the past years. The times I had ignored my instincts, the times I had trusted love over truth. I would not do that again. The place I was going was not somewhere I ever thought I would step into on my own. It was a quiet office building on the other side of town. Nothing dramatic about it. No signs shouting importance. Just glass doors and people coming and going, each carrying their own private worries. Inside, I sat in a waiting area that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. My hands rested in my lap. I did not fidget. I did not cry. When my name was called, I stood and followed a woman down a narrow hallway. She gestured for me to sit. Her voice was calm, respectful. She looked at me when she spoke, not through me. That alone felt like a gift. I placed the envelope on the table between us. I need to understand what's happening to my life, I said. She listened. Really listened. I spoke slowly, carefully, telling my story without anger, without exaggeration. I talked about staying, about trusting, about discovering things that didn't feel right, about pressure, about deadlines. As I spoke, something strange happened. The fear loosened its grip. Because speaking truth out loud, to someone who hears you, changes the shape of that truth inside your body. When I finished, she took a deep breath and said, "I'm glad you came." Those words almost broke me. I asked questions. She answered them plainly. She explained things in a way that did not make me feel small or stupid. She told me what steps were possible, not promises, not magic fixes, just clarity. Clarity is powerful. When I left that building, the world looked sharper, louder, more real. I walked back to the bus stop with my shoulders straighter than they had been in years. That evening, my phone rang. My daughter. I let it ring twice before answering. "Mama," she said quickly, "we need to talk." "We've been talking," I replied. "No, really talk," she insisted. "You're making things complicated." I closed my eyes. "You made them complicated when you decided for me." She sighed hard. "Why are you doing this?" That question again. "I'm not doing anything," I said. "I'm stopping something." Silence. Then her voice changed, softer, careful. "You know we love you." I felt the sting behind my eyes but did not let it take over. "Love does not move in secret," I said. "Love does not rush people out of their own lives." She did not answer. The call ended without goodbye. The next few days felt tense, like the air before a storm. Neighbors looked at me differently, like they sensed something was happening. I kept my routines: church, groceries, short walks when my legs allowed. One afternoon, Mrs. Coleman stopped me outside. "They're talking," she said quietly. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew. "Your children," she replied. "They've been telling people you're confused, that you don't remember things right anymore." The words hit me harder than any threat. Not because I believed them, but because I knew exactly what they were trying to do. They were rewriting me. That night, I sat alone in my living room, the lights low. I thought about every time I had swallowed my pride for the sake of peace. Every time I had stayed silent to protect my children's image. Every time I had let them speak for me. I realized something then. Staying had taught them they could define me. Standing up would teach them they could not. The next morning, I received a message from my son. "We need to settle this, today." I stared at the screen for a long time before typing back. "We will, on my terms." An hour later, they arrived. No stranger this time, just them. They sat across from me, tension thick in the room. My daughter looked tired. My son looked angry. "You're embarrassing us," he said bluntly. I nodded. "That tells me everything." My daughter leaned forward. "People are starting to ask questions." "Good," I said softly. They both froze. "What do you mean, good?" my son snapped. "I mean," I replied, "the truth does not like darkness." They stared at me like they didn't recognize me. And in a way, they didn't. Because the woman sitting in front of them was not the one who stayed quiet anymore. The conversation went in circles. Accusations, excuses, raised voices, tears that felt more like frustration than regret. Through it all, I stayed calm. Because I finally understood something important. I did not need them to admit what they had done. I only needed to stop letting them do it. When they left that day, the house felt different. Not empty. Clear. I sat alone and listened to the silence, and for the first time, it did not hurt. But the calm did not last long. That evening, another message came. Not from my children. From a number I did not recognize. "You're making a mistake. This can still be handled quietly." My heart skipped. They were escalating. And now I knew for sure. This was no longer just about family. It was about control. And the next step I took would not only protect me, it would expose them. I looked around my home one more time and whispered, "I stayed for them." Then I picked up my phone. And now I'm done staying silent. The message stayed on my phone all night. I did not reply. I placed the phone face down on the table and sat there in the dark, listening to the ticking of the clock. Each second sounded louder than the last, not because time was moving faster, but because I was finally paying attention. Someone outside, my family, was involved now. That changed everything. I slept for only a few hours. When I woke up, my chest felt tight, but my mind was clear. I made myself breakfast and forced myself to eat, even though my stomach didn't want it. I washed the plate slowly, dried it carefully, and put it back in the cupboard like nothing in my life was falling apart. Routine can be a kind of armor. Later that morning, Mrs. Coleman knocked on my door. She did not smile. "They're telling people you're sick," she said quietly, "that you're not thinking straight." I closed my eyes for a moment. This was the part I had feared most. Not losing things. Losing my voice. "They're saying it with concern," she continued, "like they're worried about you." Concern. That word again. People use it like a blanket to cover harm. I thanked her and closed the door gently. My hands shook as I leaned against it. The idea that my children were planting doubts about my mind, my memory, my truth, it hurt in a way I was not prepared for. But hurt has a strange way of sharpening you. I went into my bedroom and opened the drawer where I had been keeping everything. Notes, dates, messages, copies. I read through them slowly, reminding myself of what I knew to be true. Every word grounded me. I was not confused. I was not imagining things. I was being pushed. Around midday, my phone rang again. Unknown number. I let it ring twice before answering. "This is Althea," I said. A man's voice came through, calm and confident. "Mrs. Morrow, we really should talk." "I don't know you," I replied. "You don't need to," he said. "I represent people who want this handled quietly." Quietly. That word made my stomach twist. "I have nothing to say," I told him. He chuckled softly. You might want to listen. I've listened my whole life, I said. Now it's my turn to be heard. There was a pause. You're making things harder than they need to be, he said. No, I replied. You are. The call ended. I stood there shaking, the phone heavy in my hand. They were trying to scare me. They thought fear would send me back into silence. But fear had already lived with me for years. That afternoon, I went to church even though it was Sunday. The building was quiet, cool, and familiar. I sat in the back pew and let myself breathe. I didn't pray for my children, not this time. I prayed for clarity. And as I sat there, something settled inside me. I realized that staying had trained me for this moment. Years of being overlooked had taught me patience. Years of swallowing pain had taught me endurance. Years of silence had taught me how to observe. They thought I was weak because I stayed. They did not realize staying had made me strong in ways they never learned. When I got home, there was a letter taped to my door. Not an envelope. A letter. Typed, formal, cold. It spoke about cooperation, about timelines, about outcomes. It spoke like my life was a project that needed managing. At the bottom was a name I did not recognize. But above it, above the signature, were two initials I did recognize. My daughter's. My hands trembled as I pulled the paper away from the door. She had signed something. Something she did not have the right to sign. I sat down slowly, the letter shaking in my grip. This was no longer just talk. This was action. That evening, my son showed up alone. He did not knock. He used his old key. The sound of the door opening sent a jolt through my body. He walked in like he owned the place. We need to talk, he said sharply. I stood up and faced him. You no longer have permission to come in like that. He scoffed. You're being dramatic. I walked to the door and held it open. Leave. His face darkened. You're going to regret this. I looked him straight in the eyes. So are you. He stared at me for a long moment, then laughed, shaking his head. You really think you can stop this? I know I can, I replied. He stepped closer. You stayed too long, Mama. Now things have moved on. I felt a chill run through me. No, I said. You moved on without me. He left in anger, slamming the door behind him. I locked it. I sat down on the couch and finally let the tears come. Not loud, not messy, just tears slipping down my face as I mourned the children I thought I had raised. But even as I cried, something else grew stronger. Resolve. Because now I knew the truth. They were not just walking away from me. They were trying to push me out. And tomorrow, I would take a step they never expected. One that would make it impossible to pretend I was invisible. I wiped my face, stood up and turned off the lights. I stayed for you, I whispered into the dark. But you don't get to decide how my story ends. Before I continue this story, kindly subscribe, like, turn on the bell, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I woke up before sunrise. Not because I slept well, but because my body knew something important was about to happen. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels watchful. I sat on the edge of my bed and took a deep breath, pressing my feet flat against the floor to steady myself. My hands were cold, but my mind was calm in a way I had never felt before. Today was not about reacting. It was about choosing. I made myself breakfast and ate slowly, even though my stomach was tight. I washed the plate and dried it carefully, then placed it back where it belonged. I dressed in simple clothes, nothing special, nothing weak-looking either. Just me, the woman who had stayed, the woman who was still here. Before leaving the house, I walked through each room one last time. I touched the back of the couch, the edge of the table, the wall near the doorway where I used to mark my grandchildren's height with a pencil. I did not cry. I was done crying. I locked the door and slipped the key into my bag. Outside, the air was cool. The street looked normal. Neighbors moved about their day. unaware that my world felt like it was standing on a thin line between before and after. I went where I needed to go. Not to argue. Not to beg. Not to threaten. To speak. The room was fuller than I expected. People I recognized. People who had known my children all their lives. People who had known me too, even if they had never really seen me. I sat near the front. My heart beat fast, but I sat straight. When it was my turn, I stood. For a moment, the room felt very still. I could feel eyes on me, curious, concerned, some skeptical, some already leaning toward the story my children had been telling. I did not rush. "I am Althea Morrow," I said. "I am 74 years old." My voice did not shake. "I am here because things are being said about me that are not true, and I have been quiet long enough." There was a murmur in the room. I spoke slowly, using simple words. I did not accuse. I did not exaggerate. I told the truth as it was. I talked about staying, about raising my children alone, about trusting them when I should have asked more questions, about discovering papers I did not understand because no one wanted me to understand them, about being pushed, rushed, spoken over. I talked about fear. And then I talked about choice. "I stayed for my children because I believed love meant sacrifice," I said. "But love does not mean disappearing. Love does not mean being erased." I saw faces change as I spoke. I saw people shift in their seats. I saw understanding replace doubt. When I finished, the room was quiet. Not the empty kind. The listening kind. Afterward, people came up to me. Some hugged me. Some just nodded. Some said nothing at all but looked at me differently than they had before. I walked out of that room lighter than I had felt in years. That afternoon, my phone started ringing. I did not answer. Messages came in one after another. From my daughter. From my son. From numbers I did not recognize. I turned the phone off. For once, I did not need to hear what they had to say. When I got home, something was different. Neighbors waved at me. Mrs. Coleman stood on her porch and gave me a small smile that said everything. I unlocked my door and stepped inside, closing it gently behind me. The house no longer felt hollow. It felt claimed. That evening, there was another knock at my door. This one was softer. I opened it. My daughter stood there alone. She looked smaller than I remembered, tired. Her eyes were red like she had been crying, though I did not know if the tears were for me or for herself. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. I stepped aside. She stood in the living room, looking around like she was seeing it for the first time. "I didn't think you would do that," she said finally. "I didn't either," I replied. She swallowed. "People are talking." "Yes," I said, "they are." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and something flickered across her face. Fear, real fear. "You embarrassed us," she said. I nodded slowly. "You tried to erase me." She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. "I stayed for you," I said. "I stayed until staying almost destroyed me." Her shoulders sagged. "We were just trying to move forward." "No," I replied. "You were trying to move without me." She wiped her eyes. "What do you want now?" I thought about that question for a long time. "I want peace," I said, "but not the kind that costs me myself." She nodded slowly. "I don't know what happens next," she said. "Neither do I replied, "but it won't happen in silence." She left without hugging me. And that was okay. Later that night, I sat alone with the lights low. I thought about everything that had happened, the years I stayed, the moment they walked away, the strength I didn't know I had until I needed it. I realized something important then. Staying had been my past. Standing was my present. And what came next would be my future. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. Because the final chapter of this story was no longer about them. It was about what happens when a woman who stayed finally chooses herself. And was just about to begin. Before I continue this story, kindly subscribe, like, turn on the bell, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. That night, after my daughter left, I did not rush to fill the silence. I let it sit with me. The house was quiet again, but this time it did not feel like loss. It felt like space. Space to breathe. Space to think. Space to finally hear my own voice without it being covered by someone else's needs. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my favorite chair, the one they never liked because they said it looked old. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and stared at the wall where my family photos once hung. I could still see their shapes in my mind. Birthdays, school days, smiles that once felt real. I did not hate my children. That surprised me. After everything they had done, after how easily they tried to push me aside, I thought hate would come. But it didn't. What came instead was something quieter and heavier. Acceptance. I finally accepted that loving someone does not guarantee they will love you the same way back. And staying for them does not mean they will stay for you. The next morning, I woke up feeling different. Not lighter. Stronger. I moved through my day slowly, carefully, the way I always had, but now there was intention behind every step. I called the people I needed to call. I followed through on the steps I had already started. I asked questions. I listened closely. I did not let anyone rush me. For the first time in my life, I was not afraid of being called difficult. Let them say it. Difficult is often just another word people use when they can no longer control you. Over the next few days, the messages slowed. The calls stopped. The pressure faded, not because they suddenly respected me, but because they realized something had changed. I was no longer alone in silence. People knew. Not my version filled with anger or blame, just the truth. Plain, steady, honest. And the truth has a way of standing on its own. My son came by once more, unannounced, but this time he stayed outside. He stood on the porch like a stranger, his hands in his pockets. "You didn't have to go that far," he said. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. "I went exactly as far as I needed to," I replied. He shook his head. "You made things messy." "No," I said. "I made them visible." He looked at me for a long moment, like he was seeing me clearly for the first time. Not as his mother, not as someone who would always bend, but as a woman. "You stayed too long," he muttered. "Yes," I agreed, "but I didn't stay forever." He left without another word. Weeks passed. The house settled into a new rhythm. I rearranged the furniture the way I liked it. I brought back some of the things they had removed. I hung one picture on the wall, just one. A photo of me when I was younger, standing tall, smiling without apology. I wanted to remember. Who I had been before staying became my whole identity. One afternoon, I sat on the porch with Mrs. Coleman, the sun warm on our faces. She looked at me and smiled. "You look peaceful," she said. "I feel honest," I replied. That felt better than peace. My daughter called one evening. Her voice was quieter than before. "People keep asking questions," she said. "Yes," I replied. "They will." There was a pause. "I didn't think you would do this." "I didn't either," I said gently. Another pause. "I don't know how to fix this." I took a deep breath. "You don't fix it by pretending it didn't happen." She was quiet for a long time. "I'm not ready," she said finally. "I know," I replied. When the call ended, I did not feel relief or sadness. I felt grounded. Because her readiness was no longer my responsibility. One evening, as I sat alone watching the sky darken, I thought about the title of my story. I stayed for them. They walked away from me. For a long time, I believed that made me foolish, weak, too soft. But now I understood something different. Staying was not my mistake. Staying was my sacrifice. And sacrifices are not meant to last forever. They are meant to teach you when it is time to stop giving. I stood up and walked through my house, touching the walls, the door frames, the things that had held my life for so long. This place was still mine. My name, my history, my breath inside it. I had not won anything loud. There were no cheers, no dramatic endings. But I had something better. I had my voice. I had my dignity. And I had the quiet strength of a woman who finally chose herself. If you are listening to this story and you see yourself in it, let me tell you something from one grandmother's heart to yours. Staying does not make you small, but knowing when to stop staying is what makes you free. I stayed for them. They walked away from me. And in that walking away, I finally found myself. If this story touched you, please subscribe, like, and turn on the notification bell for more emotional stories like this. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Somewhere out there, I might be reading.